Back in my late teens, early 20s, I was super into the paranormal. I went on ghost hunts pretty much every weekend and bought ghost hunting equipment like voice recorders and an EMF detector that I'm 95% sure was just a stud finder with a sticker on it. I even started a ghost hunting group with a dumb acronym name. It was called WISP, or the Wisconsin Investigation Society for the Paranormal. I got a lot of pictures of orbs and all the other ghost stuff, a couple of creepy EVPs that are spooky but probably pretty explainable. But there's one incident that I just can't shake or explain. It's the one that made me want to believe in the first place. A few friends and I were driving around in the middle of the countryside of Wisconsin. It's relatively flat, and it was in October, I think, so all of the crops had been harvested, and the ground was literally just flat brown dirt with a few random trees and small hills. Anyway, there were 4 of us in the car, and it was probably like 10 p.m., so it was really dark. We saw another car's headlights about a mile or so away from us, heading to the same 4-way intersection as us, but coming from the right. So if we were heading north, this car was moving east to west. As we got closer to the intersection, the car was getting closer, obviously, and was coming up to the stop sign for the intersection. As we got into the intersection, though, the car didn't slow down at all and it sped up. It was heading right for us. We all turned and screamed and saw the headlights getting closer and closer, and right when it should have hit us, it vanished. We slammed on the brakes, got out of the car, and there was nothing. We could see for a mile or two in every direction, and the car just wasn't there. It's not like it was a drunk driver who went into a ditch or hit a tree or just turned his lights off and kept going. The car was just gone. All 4 of us knew we saw it. We were all screaming and bracing for impact. Maybe it was mass hysteria or something, but a few months after this incident, the other 3 guys and 1 other buddy were back in their car, driving in the same area, and got T-boned by a drunk driver and were severely injured. I feel really lucky I wasn't in the car that time, and while I'm sure it's just a weird coincidence, it creeps the hell out of me. I went on a pub crawl in my early 20s and wound up at a bar my buddy's dad ran. I had gotten extremely drunk to the point of seeing the ceiling spin and quickly ran into the men's restroom to empty my guts. Once I started throwing up in my somehow locked bathroom stall. Someone started pounding on the stall door, like ramming it at a run at one point. In between mouthfuls of vomit, I kept politely responding with things like, "1 minute," or "Buddy, just let me finish spewing," to more traditional angry expletives. After a particularly hard slam that really tested the shoddy turn lock, I angrily shouted, "If you don't freaking stop, I'm coming out there and beating the ever-living daylights out of you." Silence. I burst out of the stall in the most intimidating way possible in my inebriated state, and absolutely no one else was in there. I ran out to the friends I was with, asking where the guy who went in after me was, and they told me no one had followed. A while later, I talked to my friend whose dad ran the place and told him the story. Mentioned maybe some of his dad's employees were rude. He just kind of looked at me, somewhat spooked, and said, "Yeah, apparently that place is haunted as heck. The men's restroom especially. People don't go in there alone because of it. I think you told a ghost you were going to beat the crap out of it." I always believed in some type of afterlife and heard many stories of people who aren't bullshitters experiencing something. I was in my garage talking to my girlfriend who was standing in the doorway entering the house. About 10 to 15 feet behind her was our downstairs living room that has a sliding glass door and stairs going to the 2nd level. Her brother walks in with a little girl with blonde hair following him. We all have small kids, but I know all the friends and playmates they have and didn't recognize her. I inquired to my girlfriend as to who the little girl was. She goes and checks it out, and he comes down with a big grin. He's known to see spirits, and I believe him without a doubt because the guy loves to talk to me about anything. However, he doesn't bring up his gift. He just doesn't talk about it. Anyway, he says that there's a little blonde-haired girl who lives at the house. She's always around. So a year later, my girlfriend had my son prematurely, and we ended up staying in the hospital for a while. Her brother stays at the house and tells us that Emily is really sad, and he can tell she's nervous and wondering why we aren't home. My newborn gets better, and we head home and walk in, and you can just feel this heaviness vanish, followed by a very happy feeling. So in short, I have 5 kids total. 4 are biologically mine and of this world, and the 5th is Emily, and she's by far my best behaved. My 1 and 3-year-old will be very hyper running around, and I have to announce to Emily that it's time for bed for everybody. They instantly crash. She's a good kid. I don't want to open any doors, so I'm not looking into the history. A lady who works with my mom told us this story one day when they came over for dinner. We had been talking about creepy movies, and she decided to tell us about some of the weird stuff at their new place. They had just bought a house in the Wilmington, North Carolina area, had moved in, and everything was going fine until one day she opened the silverware drawer and found a tooth sitting on top of the silverware. It was weird, and no one knew how it got there, but they threw it away and tried to get on with their lives. A couple of weeks later, it happened again. Opened the silverware drawer. Tooth. Now it's super weird, but again the tooth gets tossed out and ignored. Kept happening. Over the next 6 months, they kept on finding teeth every couple of weeks. They got a home security system with motion detectors and cameras and stuff because they figured they had a particularly sick prankster in the area. But even though they kept finding teeth, the system never detected anyone leaving them. One day, she's at home and gets a call from her husband telling her to get out of the house right then because the security alarm went off, saying that all of the doors and windows had just opened at the same time. She left for a few hours, but nothing had opened or closed. Finally, they got fed up and went to talk to the lady who had sold them the house. She still lived in town and had built a house that was almost an exact replica of the one they had sold to this couple. That in itself was a little weird, but she completely refused to talk about the previous house and shut the door in their faces when they asked about it. They're not happy, but weird stuff is only happening every few weeks, so it's not enough to drive them out of the house or anything. The last incident that I know of was about a month or 2 ago. She went down to the basement to do the laundry, and when she opened the dryer, there was a tooth sitting on top of the clothes. She says that she felt something cold hit her in the face, almost like getting hit with a pillow, and blacked out. Her husband found her a little while later thrashing around on the floor. They called the paramedics, and she came back around and was fine. That was the end of the story. No resolution, no explanation, and no other weird stuff lately. It was the freakiest thing I'd ever heard. My father does not believe in the paranormal in the slightest. He moved to California from Mexico in the late 70s. He was the first and only person in his family to do so at the time. Even more than a decade later, he was the only one in the US. At some point in the very early 90s, he met my mother, and they got married rather quickly. She became pregnant with me soon after, and they began to go to prenatal doctor treatments. One evening, very close to my due date, my parents were driving down the highway on their way to the doctor for another appointment. My mom says my dad suddenly gasped and started trying to exit the highway in an attempt to go back a few exits. He seemed desperate, which freaked my mother out. She asked him what happened, and he said that he just saw his youngest brother, who was still supposedly very much in Mexico, waving to him on the side of the highway, in the middle of San Francisco. My mom told him he was crazy but humored him and let him drive over to the place he thought he saw him. Obviously, there was no one there, and they continued to their appointment. Once they got back home, my father received a call that his youngest brother had passed away in a very tragic accident. I was born very soon afterward, and my parents named me after my uncle. It makes me sad to think about how hard it must be to lose a baby brother but not be able to go to the funeral or anything. When I was about 12 to 13, my best friend and I rode our bikes and discovered this small hidden graveyard. It was back by some railroad tracks and under big buzzing power lines far from any houses. There was barbed wire around the graveyard, and the tombstones were mainly faded, but we could see some of the dates from the late 1800s. We stopped and took pics for fun, but didn't think much of it. Well, for about 2 years after that, I'd wake up every night between 3 to 3:30 a.m. because I'd hear papers rustling in my room. Then, I'd hear what sounded like footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping once it reached the foot of my bed. I peeked a few times and didn't see anything. I started sleeping with the TV on to block it out. Eventually, I woke up one night because I heard what sounded like dozens of people whispering loudly in my ear and screamed for my mom. I told my parents about it, and my religious mom threw holy water around the house. Then my dad bought flowers and told us to bring them to the graveyard. It stopped after that. I always thought that maybe I just had night terrors or something or imagined it. Recently, I'm now 25. I mentioned this to my dad again, and he said he'd also heard footsteps at night, but thought I was just getting some water or something at 3 a.m. Spooky. I was home alone for the weekend when I was in high school, which was exciting for me as I never really had the house to myself before. I had a few people over on Friday night and got hammered. Then the next night, it was just me home alone in my house. I had a case of beers left over and a movie to watch, so I decided that the hangover would not keep me down and to party by myself and have an awesome night. I ended up getting way too drunk and felt hungry. I decided to cook a mad feed and started whipping up pasta in a drunken slur. I was singing like a maniac while I played MasterChef in my kitchen, thinking I was top shit. Halfway through singing and stirring the pasta sauce, I hear a tapping sound and some movement in the corner of my eye that catches my attention. One of the metal chain ropes used to pull the blinds up and down on the glass doors was moving and hitting the glass door, making a tapping sound. I froze as I watched it move back and forth by itself. Then my focus kind of zoomed out as I realized that was not the only metal blind rope that was moving. We have around 7 sets of blinds on the glass doors, and all 7 of the ropes were moving back and forth. My hair stood up, and I walked out of the kitchen as all of them were tapping on the glass doors. No windows or doors in the house were open, and they were picking up momentum with the tapping becoming louder and more frequent. I turned around just in time to see the DVD case of the movie I was watching slide off the TV cabinet on its own. I let out a slurred "fuck that" and went to bolt outside, just freaking out. On the way out, I saw the painting next to the front door. It had been moved and was tilted. I let out a gasp. I ran out the door and wet myself just a little in the process. Shit was real, the horror was real, this was real. Outside, I was so distraught and horrified at what had just happened. My house was haunted. There was a fucking ghost and it was fucking with me. It didn't like me. I realized that I had left the stove on and that I needed to leave but needed to grab my phone to call someone and get out of there. I decided I would go to the park and try to contact a friend. So I psyched myself up, ran into the house, turned off the stove, shitting myself, ran into my room, grabbed the key, my phone, and 10 beers. I headed to the park and started drinking again. No one picked up as everyone was wiped out from the night before. Cut a long story short, I vaguely remember being at the park before I blacked out, then in my kitchen crying at some point, then blank. The next day, I woke up in my bed. I wondered whether it was just a dream, but I walked out and saw the pasta and DVD case and realized that it was legit. I realized that I had to break the news to my family later that day that our house was haunted and that we would have to move. I went on Facebook, and that's when I saw status after status saying that there had been a minor earthquake during the night. Needless to say, I felt like a hungover idiot, but the truth is that was the first earthquake I had experienced, and we don't get earthquakes where I live. Or not usually, at least. One time when I was about 6, I was living with my parents and my grandma in a trailer park in Florida. The bathroom was right across the hall from my parents' room, and the hallway was narrow because it was a trailer. So, one day when no one was home, I had to go to the bathroom. Normally, I would close the door out of common courtesy, but since no one was home, I left it wide open. My parents' bed was positioned so that the foot was in the center of the room, with the head at the opposite end of the room from where I was in the bathroom, if that makes sense. So, I'm chilling on the toilet, looking at a shampoo bottle or something, when all of a sudden, a black dress outlining a female body with no figure in the dress rose up behind my parents' bed, hovered there for a second, and proceeded to float behind my parents' door. Those few seconds were horrifying because it looked like the black dress was flying right at me. I was so shaken that I immediately finished my business in the bathroom and checked behind the door, literally ready to confront whatever it was. But when I checked behind the door, there was nothing there. It was the weirdest, trippiest thing I've ever seen, and I still question to this day whether it was real or just the product of an overly active imagination. But I'm not misremembering things, because I was genuinely terrified by the dress and was ready to confront whatever it was. All I can say is that now, I always keep the door closed when going to the bathroom. When I was a kid, I saw someone standing clear as day in my parents' bedroom as I was cycling past. I figured it was one of my parents until I saw them both outside. We checked inside. No one was there, and there was no way they could have left without passing by. When my aunt died, her niece took her car and drove it to her funeral. She took anything with a plug from the house. After the funeral, we were all forced to go somewhere the niece wanted to go because she refused to go to the place our aunt would have wanted, feeling it was beneath her. The minute we arrived, the lights started flashing, and the place developed a massive electrical problem. We all laughed it off because we're not superstitious. A week later, the niece's partner, who hated helping our aunt and made our aunt give her money, got diagnosed with what killed my aunt, and now she's having to look after him. My friend had a couple of creepier things happen to him. When he was a kid, he got home from school. His parents had split, and he was staying with his dad that evening. So he comes in through the door, hears his dad say something, and calls back to him that he couldn't hear what he said. At this point, he realizes his dad isn't home. Then, still standing at the front door, he realizes he can hear something in his room, above him, and then suddenly hears thundering footsteps charging towards the door. He noped the hell out of there and went to stay with his mom. When his dad got home, there was no evidence that anyone had been there. Same friend, much older now, went to the pub with his best mate. Neither had had a drink, can't remember why, but they went for a walk through the countryside after it went dark, common where I'm from. They're walking along a country road towards the golf course and both look at each other at the same time as they see a young woman in a wedding dress walk into the road. They both decide to approach her to see if she's okay. They don't want to scare her because it is very dark and where she stood is well lit because of the golf club. But they're a ways back, so she wouldn't be able to see them at this point. They slowly walk towards her, and as they get about 50 to 100 meters from her, she vanishes, doesn't go anywhere, vanishes as it disappears in front of their eyes. Apparently, a woman had been killed by a horse and trapped there on her wedding day way back when. My mate jokes about a lot of stuff, but those two events really spooked him, and he wasn't quite the same after seeing the woman in the dress. He certainly isn't as keen to go on a midnight stroll anymore. Oh, and my mum was a creepy kid. One day she was playing with her toys, nothing out of the blue, and she stops playing and declares that the wife of a family friend is going to die, insert date here, then goes back to playing. Everyone is pretty weirded out by this but just decides she's crackers. Said lady died on that date almost a year later. That side of the family ended up being pretty superstitious in the end. My great-uncle had a real issue thinking that the Chinaware was being put out by ghosts in the morning, but he had a lot of brothers, so they were probably winding him up. Apparently, he spent his life paranoid about ending up being a haunted, poor guy. So when I was about 10, my grandfather died while we were on vacation. He'd been on a downhill slope for a couple of years after some surgery in which a blood clot broke apart and traveled to his brain. He told us to go ahead and spend the rest of the trip out having a good time. Didn't want this to be the vacation where Granddaddy died. Pretty selfless guy, TBH. I miss him. So my parents didn't tell me and my siblings until we got back in town. Now, it's important to know that he was cremated and wanted his ashes spread in a specific desert area in Arizona. We live in Alabama, so I'm not quite sure what the connection was, but it was important to him, so we planned to do it. A few days after we got back in town from the vacation where Granddaddy died, we slowly realized that the microwave was randomly turning itself on. Usually it was only for a few seconds, but it got to be frequent enough that we'd keep a cup of water in there so that it wouldn't cook itself to death. Of course, after we did that, it turned itself on at night and boiled all of the water out of this measuring cup, about 2 cups, left burn marks on the glass and killed itself. So we got a new microwave and the exact same thing happened. Anyway, the microwave self-suicide stopped after we spread the ashes. Probably just a coincidence, but it's a fun story. When my dad ends up getting worried about me or anyone else in the family, I jokingly bring up the fact that the microwave still works, so obviously nobody has come back to haunt it. I haven't told this story to many people. I'm always too nervous that people will think I'm crazy or just won't take in what I say. This is a 2-night story, so I'll do my best to keep it short. I'm sorry if this ends up being long. During the first night, I was on the phone with my girlfriend at the time. This was in high school, so talking or texting on your cell phone to stay up late was cool and fun. My bedroom used to be my parents' old one, so it had a large set of French doors with glass panes so you could see right through. I would close them at night. Normally, my mom would yell upstairs if she heard me on the phone. This night, I heard a loud thud/scraping noise of the wood rubbing as the door opened slightly. I saw a silhouette of what looked like my mom. I asked her what was going on and told her that I was getting off my phone, but I had no answer and she wouldn't move at all. She just stood there. I walked up to the door, and as I approached, it's like my memory was erased. No one was standing at the door, and when I went into the hallway, it was completely black and no one was awake in the house. The second night, I was in bed again. This time, I was just trying to get some sleep. My head felt chaotic, almost as if some stringy, electrical current was running through it. I tossed and turned, getting more and more frustrated. Finally, I flipped onto my back during another attempt to get comfortable. It was at this moment that I felt a pair of hands plant on my chest and push me hard down into my bed. On the rebound, I jolted up and went for the stairs, trying to get comfort from my mother, who I could hear was watching TV as I approached the stairway. The whole ordeal continued because as I walked down the stairs, I felt like I was moving in slow motion, dragging my hand on the wall the entire way down. On top of that, I felt nothing but anger and the urge to hurt someone. I have a temper, but I'm not an aggressive type of person who would have serious thoughts of actually hurting someone. Finally, the craziness ended when I saw my mom in the living room. I felt like the anger and tenseness were ripped away from my body, and I sobbed while my mom comforted me. I had many more experiences in my parents' house growing up, but these were definitely the most intense. When I was around 15 to 17 years old, I lived in a house in a Las Vegas suburb that was haunted. The house had a peculiar layout, primarily centered around the master bedroom, where most of the unsettling events occurred. My bedroom was just down the hall and had a direct view of the master bedroom. Initially, it started with feelings of being watched, hearing strange noises, and catching glimpses of things out of the corner of my eye, mostly confined to the loft and bathroom in the master bedroom. Over time, the eerie atmosphere expanded to encompass most of the second floor, except for the two smaller bedrooms where my sisters and I slept. The situation progressively worsened the longer we lived there, reaching a point where we all felt constantly angry and paranoid. At night, all the bedroom doors would rattle, objects would disappear only to reappear in random locations, like the drop light over the stairway, and we'd occasionally hear a man's voice emanating from the master bedroom, though we knew it wasn't my ex-stepdad. Now, what I'm about to say might sound cliché, but things took a turn for the worse when my mom was diagnosed with cancer. Being the oldest among a large number of siblings, I had to assume the role of a caretaker for a while, which deeply affected me during my high school years. One day, while sitting on the couch in the living room with my younger brother and sister, engrossed in my phone, I distinctly felt a man's breath on my ear, causing my hair to move. Initially, I thought it was my brother playing a prank, but he and my sister were too far away to have reached me without my noticing. This incident unsettled me, but I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. Shortly after, while bathing my youngest brother in the master bathroom's jacuzzi tub, I witnessed one of his towels sliding out of the closet and halting halfway to the vanity. Without hesitation, I scooped up my brother and hurried out of there. Not long after that, I moved out, but the memories of that house and what transpired there still haunt me, often creeping into my nightmares. My wife, our infant daughter, and I resided in an apartment with a rich history, formerly a myriad of establishments, from a child's funeral parlor to a bar and even a brothel. Despite its age, the apartment boasted ample space and affordable rent, nestled in a decent neighborhood. One evening, as I lounged on the couch watching TV, my daughter, a spirited toddler, darted past me towards the kitchen. Negotiating her way between the couch's edge and a sharp-cornered computer desk was no easy feat, but her determination to explore knew no bounds. Exhausted and late into the night, I intercepted her, redirecting her towards her mother, who was diligently folding laundry across the room. Resuming my attention to the TV, I was startled when, moments later, my daughter once again attempted her kitchen escapade. Frustration mounting, I firmly reiterated the command, no, and returned her to her mother's care. However, my resolve was tested when, mere minutes later, I noticed a familiar head of blonde hair slipping past the gap and disappearing into the kitchen. My patience worn thin, fatigue and stress fueled my reaction. With a thunderous roar, I stormed into the kitchen, only to witness the cupboard under the sink closing before my eyes. In that tense moment, my wife's voice cut through the air, her expression drained of color as she held our daughter in her arms. "Who the hell was that?" she demanded, her fear palpable. To this day, we never dared to investigate the intruder. Subscribe if you enjoy the video or watch another.